So we're at the stage now where it's time to start thinking about components and component reuse. Now, what I like to do is think about components in terms of a pure function. Now, instead of having a giant function with hundreds of lines of code, it totally makes sense to break out our functions into lots of smaller pieces. For example, if we're parsing a date into a string, let's break it out into a function. If we are converting some data, or perhaps joining some data, let's convert it into a function and break it out. So in this case, we are displaying some data. We want to display each particular donut in the DOM for the user. You can, of course, code this completely in the template, and that is the approach that we're going to take, and then we're going to convert it over to its own reusable DOM component. So what we're going to do is jump into the div. Let's go ahead and add donut-card. So the idea behind this is we're going to create the template for our individual card. We're then going to break it into its own component so we know how to create DOM components. We can then pass the data down to these DOM components, which means that they are then optimized for reuse. We can also then test the standalone DOM components on their own, pass in some data, and then test the particular output. But we'll come onto that in the more advanced course. Now, to make our donut card look a bit more inviting, let's move away from this boring background and start to introduce some images. For this, we're not going to use the data binding syntax. We're going to point towards our assets/image, and we're going to look at an SVG file. We're also going to use an alt attribute, and we're also going to create a class which we can just add for now. So that's going to be the setup for our image. If we then save this, this would then give us an error because this is not a valid image path. So what we essentially want to do is take our icon, and you can see that this is more of a slug, just chocolate. Now, a slug is essentially something we might use in the URL. So inside of our images, we then have all the names for our donut. So here we have just chocolate.svg. So what we're going to do is take our icon and then pass this in. To do this, we can simply use some interpolation. So we can say donut.icon. This is then going to take the value. If we then hit save, you can see that we end up with something like this. Now, because we have the name just chocolate, we're also going to supply this as the alt text. So we can say donut.name, and this is then introducing some accessibility. Now, because we want to bind it, we're going to use that square bracket syntax. We don't want to bind a dynamic class right now. So I'm just going to call this the donut card and then icon. We'll then write some styles as we move things into its own component. If we then save this out, we can then inspect element just to make sure that our alt text is being added. And you can see here that we have our image that's then rendered from Angular. So that takes care of that. Let's move down and create a div around our donut price and the donut name. Inside of the div, we can create a p tag, and underneath we can create another p tag. Now, the first one is going to be the donut name. So we can say class equals donut-card-name. Similarly, we can add class equals donut-card- and then price. So if we save this out, we then really see too much of a difference, but it would then be some time to then introduce some styling. So this allows us to then create the definition for a particular product. So if we scroll down and choose a new one, we can change our index lookup to a different donut, and you can see that when we change these, we then select completely different ones. So this is now allowing us to dynamically select, and essentially we've created a template for this particular product. However, we only have one product. We don't have the ability to iterate over them. So at this point, it's a great idea for us to break out this chunk of code into its own component. So we're going to call this the donut card component, which means if we jump into our separate terminal instance, so we can turn to npx ng generate component. We want to add this inside our admin, and we're going to then create a new components folder. So this is going to hold all of our DOM components. The component we want to create is going to be the donut card. And I like to simply mimic the top level class name for what is going to be the element name. So when we come to style things, it's nice and simple. So if we then hit enter, this is going to update our admin module. So if we jump into there, we can see that we have our new donut card component, which is then added to our declarations. More importantly, we have our components/donut card. And here we have our donut card component, which means if we go back and we want to declare it, we can say donut-card and then close off our component. We can save this out and you can see that this is then compiled successfully. So we've now created a second component and we can call these whatever we like. I prefer to use something like a donut card because it's nice and generic. But now this component becomes a nice standalone piece of functionality and it means that we could reuse it somewhere else. So let's go ahead and actually do that. Let's move this logic down into our donut card component and then we'll work out how to pass this individual piece of data down into the component for consumption. So if we save this now, all of our changes are now gone. But of course, we want to jump into our template and then add the code for our donut card. However, we now have a huge problem. We see lots of red underlines. Property donut does not exist on type card component. The idea now is we want to somehow pass this data from our container component, our smart component. Remember, this component is in charge of the data and handing it down. So what we want to do is pass the donut down to this particular component. So with that in mind, let's dive into the next lesson.